voices that our community has. And it's an exercise in learning from each other, in getting to know what we think about this kind of issues. So as part of these conversations, since yesterday, we've been listening to the young voices, the voices that are active out there in our communities. And for us, it was very important to have our activists, the leaders of the organizations that are working with the communities. And that's why it is my privilege to introduce today Sandra Davila. Elgin, she represents, and she created, actually, Elgin in Solidarity of Black Lives Matter. Thank you so much, Sandra, and the microphone is yours.
Gracias. Good morning, everyone. So I have a lot prepared for you that I'm not going to be able to tell you everything. So if you see me or if you want to contact me, my contact information is in the next slide. Claudia. Take a picture. You can catch me around in the room. I was going to do a land acknowledgement, show you a video from the perspective of Native Americans themselves, but we're short on time, so I encourage you to find this video. It's from the U.S. Department of Justice, and it explains what a land acknowledgement is. Since we're short on time, we're gonna go ahead and do it. So I'm going to please ask you to please stand up. I would like to invite us to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. Recognizing that we are on unceded land is an important thing to do because it acknowledges the present of the United States is a collection of chopped up territories, land purchases accumulated by genocide. We are thankful to be able to be here and have this event. We ask that everyone be conscious of their place here on the ancestral homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. Chicago was also a site of trade and healing for the Miami, Ho-Chunk, and Sauk. Let us all be aware of our role in colonialism. Remembering the history and honoring the contributions and traditions of indigenous peoples is only one step towards fighting their erasure. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, and extend our recognition to their descendants. Thank you. I would encourage the Mexican consulate in Chicago to implement land acknowledgements. It is not an uncommon practice for governmental entities to do this. If you'd like any help or support, you can also encourage your schools or your city council to be able to do it. So Elgin in Solidarity was created out of the uproar of what happened in 2020. I was unjustly arrested with some folks. Short story, long story made short. Our mission is, we are a grassroots organization that welcomes everyone to organize, agitate, educate ourselves and our neighbors about white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy in order to take action and liberate the most vulnerable community members in Elgin and surrounding areas to have an equitable and healthy community for now and for the future generations. This is entirely connected to what they were talking about before, encouraging young folks to take action and including us in the conversations. I don't know if I'm that young, but let's. So yes, this is the Cynthia Clemens. Please say her name. She's a victim of state violence. This is why the movement also hit home for Elginites, because the Cynthia Clemens, by then was 34, was killed by Elgin police on Interstate 90 in March of 2018. The cop, to this day, is employed by the Elgin Police Department, earning about $120,000 a year. Our aim was to organize one march That was it. But the people continued to reach out, and we continued to organize, and we continued to build community, and until the point that we got to city council and with demands for police accountability, for accessibility, and we have 5 of our 6 demands accomplished. The one that's left is the firing of the police officer that killed Cynthia Clemens. The case is still open. So as the panel previous to my presentation, they were talking about how our struggles are connected. Yes, we are connected and we have to recognize it, but I think we should move a little bit past that and be able to have a conversation about how and what does that look like in your daily life. So this beautiful, those beautiful circles there are really enlightening. I would encourage you to Google intersectionalism and how it affects me. That quote there, amamos el barrio, pero nuestros sueños están fuera de él. I want to make Elgin, we want to make Elgin a city where when the youth grow up, they don't leave. They don't want to leave, where their goal is not leaving Elgin to come to Chicago. We want to have a welcoming city, a healthy city, a vibrant city that welcomes everyone, and people want to stay and make it grow and build community. That's our goal. So we continue to do so by connecting with each other and understanding how we are connected. This is a picture of Victoria, who is a Salvadorian immigrant killed by Mexican police. Jamaica, Haiti, Nigeria are top birthplaces for black immigrants in the U.S. El mismo racismo que nos deporta mató a George Floyd. I love that quote. The same racism that killed George Floyd is the racism that deports us. So what do? We do community teach-ins. What is abolition? What's your role in abolition? We stand in solidarity with BIPOC organizations and individuals. We have events, anything from showing up to a city council meeting to having a cookout or riding a bicycle. We have members in the police review board, which was created as a result of Elgin and Solidarity for police accountability. We also have, I'm a commissioner for the Human Relations Commission in Elgin to implement equity and diversity and inclusion in the city of Elgin. We can go ahead. The intergenerational struggle that we were talking about. How are you connecting? And this is for you to reflect. How are you connecting to the youth? And how are you connecting to the elders? And if you're not connected, look for ways. Give me a call. I'll give you some ideas. But that is essential in our struggle. And this is what our fight looks like. This looks radical. But this is what we want. And we're stepping away from fighting to create the alternatives that we want to see, the things that we want the things that we envision. We are working to make them come true, which is unity, which is safe spaces for children, which is Pablo Serrano building a bridge from the Pilsen community to Elgin. He just unveiled that mural downtown Elgin. Also, Elgin community bikes, also community building. Mobility justice is racial justice. Streets in all of our communities should be safe for everyone to gather, move, and move regardless of race. And this is true at the most minimal level of how you walk to the train station to how mobility works and borders, how we are restricted in our mobility and who is restricting us. Who is in charge of deciding what public spaces are, where they're placed, and who interacts in those spaces? So the bicycles could be anything from a fun toy to a revolutionary tool of connection. Bibliobici is another project of mine. This was due to the pandemic and the consulate of Mexico in Chicago was very kind to donate books. Because schools were closed, I just put all the books in my bicycle and I would go household to household reading with students and giving books out. And this is what we want. This is a safe community where we can share. That's also intergenerational. Puntos de encuentro. We don't have a source of news that speaks to the community and in a regular basis, at a grassroots level, talking about what's going on in our communities. So this is our project. This is a way to connect with each other and to start creating a network. As a result of Puntos de Encuentro, the Arise from Chicago was able to connect to other organizations in the suburbs. So we're creating a network of people to continue to build community further than the big city of Chicago. Even though it's beautiful, we still need to reach out. You guys need to reach out to us, and we love coming to you. Another project, sorry it's super fast, but I hope that you're curious and intrigued. The McHenry County Cancel the ICE contract, the coalition to cancel the ICE contract in McHenry County. We worked on it for a year, and this is what it looked like. This is the jail. Only the 4th floor was for ICE detainees. We worked on it so hard. We built the coalition. We had enough momentum that we got the attention of elected officials, and we helped ICER, Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, pass legislation, Illinois Way Forward, that's going to shut down the 3 ICE detention centers in the state of Illinois. And last 2 things I want to share. Kenyan nonviolence. Kenyan nonviolence, I encourage you to look it up, and I encourage the Consulado de Mexico in Chicago to reach out, and if they're interested, you could offer these trainings to the community. These are not something these are very engaging. Kenyan nonviolence is a philosophy of nonviolent conflict reconciliation in the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the organizing strategies of the civil rights movement. However, this is a very individual fight. This will make you recognize conflict, learn how to approach it, and how to synthesize from it. This is an amazing book, and I wish I had time to read this. So this is what guides my work at the moment. Sometimes it's the words that we don't say or the actions that we don't take that can be a form of violence. Silence, isolation, neglect, abandonment, ignoring someone, not coming to someone's aid when they need help, or withholding resources from someone in need can also be as hurtful as getting beaten with a stick. So violence is clearly not just the use of physical force, and we need to include non-physical forms of harm in our understanding of violence. And I highlight this because I'm a teacher. I work with children from kindergarten through 6th grade, and I see the violence from adults not being held accountable towards kids. And this is how we perpetuate white supremacy and oppression from schools. This is where it stems from. And last but not least, racial healing circles. These are also available for the community if the consulate would be interested in collaborating and offering these for the community. They're sessions led by trained racial healing practitioners. The experience relies on intentional listening and opening your heart space to unearth truths and unconscious biases. This is also at a personal level because it starts with the individual. It starts with realizing how you are related to colonialism, how you are perpetuating oppression. And when you start to recognize how you are violent towards others and how you're maybe violent to yourself, then you start opening up a vision of what our community could look like. We also create links with different organizations. Right now we're working with the Black Alliance for Peace. If you haven't heard of them, please look them up. They are working currently on the Sudan, the AFRICOM. If you have not heard about AFRICOM, I would encourage you to reach out to them. They have teachings and they're amazing and very engaging. There's also a training for Kenyan nonviolence for anyone that's interested. They are gift economy based, which is pay as you can based on transparency. It's 16 hours, and that's going to be happening January and February. If you'd like more information, reach out. And just to finish here, I would like to really thank the Mexican consulate in Chicago for opening up this space. This is what we need. So thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sandra. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sandra. We're going to make sure that we put all that information in our Facebook platform, so people that are interested. I love the quote that you read, and now I want a book. I want to read the book. So thank you. And I'm going to have to say what was very appealing for us at the consulate about the work that Sandra does is that she's not only passionate about it, but she works with kids. And we've been talking about this throughout, yesterday and today. So I think that the model that she's following is very interesting and can be replicated. And it's very constructive. That's the tone that we wanted to put into this conversation. She said, well, perhaps what I'm wearing sounds radical, but actually the work that she does is very constructive and very positive. So we certainly admire that. And now I want to welcome our second panel. So our Consul General in Houston, there you go. So please welcome, and I pass the microphone to you. Well,
first of all, thank you very much to the Consulate of Mexico in Chicago, especially Consul Reina Torres, for inviting us to this wonderful and needed conversation. Also to thank Universidad Nacional Autónoma for hosting this event here. And for me, it's a little bit intimidated to be in this panel because I'm surrounded with very well-known lawyers in the criminal area. So thank you very much for accepting being part of this panel. I would like to just read a brief CV of them, of their professional activity. If you want to learn a little bit more of them, you can go to the webpage of the Consulate of Mexico in Chicago. Sheri Lynn Johnson is an expert on the interface of race and issues in criminal procedure and the Assistant Director of the Cornell Death Penalty Project, an initiative to foster empirical scholarships on the death penalty. Thank you very much, Sheri. Edgar Saldivar joined the ACLU of Texas in 2016 as a senior staff attorney. He defends the civil rights and civil liberties of ACLU clients in high-impact litigation in state and federal courts. His practice is focused on immigrants' rights, voting rights, and government accountability. Thank you so much, Edgar. Emmanuel Andre is founder of the Northside Transformative Law Center, a space where community members, families, and professionals come together to advocate for and accompany individuals who are navigating the criminal justice system. Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for being here. We will be presenting some graphics that will give us an idea of the different segments that we will be talking about. But as you can see, we are going to be talking about access of justice, especially how it affects the Black and brown communities. And it's a I think that first of all, we need to define what is access of justice, and I don't want to go to a very elaborative definition or very legal technical definition. I just went to Wikipedia so that we can present a very simple definition. As it says, access of justice is the right of every person to obtain immediate quality justice when facing a process from the moment of arrest until the moment of sentencing. Yesterday we were talking about how it affects the process of a person since they are detained until they have a sentence. And when we talk about access of justice, we need to focus that is a human right. It's not just an activity or a prestation, how do you say prestation? Benefit that is given by the government. It's a human right. So it needs to include like guarantees, judicial guarantees, such as the presumption of innocence, the non-retroactive of the law. Those are the main principles. But we have been seeing that what has been affecting the access of justice is the discrimination. Discrimination by judges and discrimination due to the values and culture imposed by and to the vulnerable groups. So having that in mind, we will pass to the first slide. That is very, very impacting because you can see that the United States is the world leader in incarceration, where almost 2.3 million people are in prison, nearly 25% of the world prison population. That is huge. There are factors that can influence in a person's incarceration rate, such as gender, economic situation, education, status, whatever. Race affects every single stage of the process, since the initial contact with the police until a person receives a sentence. So you can see there in the graphic how it affects like men, white men, black men, and Latino men. Having that in mind, I would like to ask Emmanuel, what is the racial profile and what is it a widespread problem?
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me, first of all.
No.
So I'm really honored to be here now that I'm given a microphone. Usually my wife doesn't want me near a microphone. But to all the dignitaries and activists and advocates and everyone else, thank you. I'm honored to be here. And even before, as I start to talk about even the racial profile, that context, I just want to put everything in context. As I sat there and I watched this, I kept thinking about Harlem, New York City. So I'm originally from Haiti. I'm an immigrant. My family was born in Haiti. I was born in Haiti. And we immigrated to the United States. And I came to Harlem, New York, and I'll never forget the moment I heard this knock. I went to the door, and I seen two people in suits. I was about to say something, and my mother said, shh. She took us back. We spread out. It was 10 of us in a two-bedroom apartment. There was not a lot of places to hide. I remember me and Pierre, my little brother, hid under the bed. And we had to be quiet because of the fear of who was on the other side. We're undocumented and the fear of immigration or whatever. I must have been maybe 6 or 7. Fast forward another 7 years, same neighborhood in Harlem, New York. I was at a grocery store. And unfortunately, my brother and myself, Pierre again, we witnessed firsthand a shooting that happened right in front of us in the grocery store. We were taken, we were swift away before the police came, anybody else came, and again, we had to hide out because of this fear of interaction with the police. So this is about, so much of it is about institutional violence and what it does and how it perpetuates how we get here. So when we talk about racial profiles, it's so easy to get detached from the numbers. I mean, the numbers show themselves. And often people say, well, numbers don't line up, but there's the stories that's underneath those numbers that frame that narrative, I think is importantly critical. And what we sometimes forget There are lots of good people in in institutions that if we're not able to hold each other accountable as to what the outcomes that we're seeing and what do we do about that, is we're just going to continue to be repeating it. So in terms of the racial profile, I mean, it's all over the place. But I myself now, as a defense attorney, and I can almost promise you, most cops, most prosecutors, or most other defense attorneys, most judges, they don't necessarily sit there and say, you're black, I'm going to give you a worse outcome. Or you're Latinx, I'm going to give you a worse outcome. But we become part of this institutional mechanism that just recreates itself. So.
Yeah, and we have at the consulate, we have seen in many occasions how that racial profile has been applied to black and brown communities, and I think that this is the moment to work together in order to see that that doesn't happen anymore. But talking about that, Edgar, what is mass incarceration and what's the meaning of that? Are they benefit to the social security or the security of the community?
First, yes, thank you. First of all, I'm honored to be here. Mass incarceration is unfortunately a tragic situation that has been going on for a long time. And the reason that mass incarceration is such a big problem, especially as it applies to black and brown communities, is you just have to look at the numbers. You saw the graphs there. You know, people in prison, first of all, 5% of the world's population is in the United States, yet the United States prison population contains 25% of the world's prison population. And if you look at the data, 1 in 106 white males is currently in prison. However, when you look at black and browns, those ratios are a lot different. For black males, it's a 1 in 15 ratio. So 1 out of every 15 black males in America is in prison. And in the Hispanic or Latinx community, it's 1 in every 36. So just looking at those discrepancies, you see that mass incarceration is a huge problem. And it really doesn't benefit anyone because, you know, as we can get into in more detail, it affects the communities, as Emmanuel has said. Communities lose trust in law enforcement when they see that justice is not applied correctly, when they see a disproportionate application of sentencing or selective enforcement. And racial profiling, I think, is a huge driver of that. You know, racial profiling, at the end of the day, is when law enforcement, or it could be private security, targets people of color, often for no reason, often for pretextual reasons, based on perceived race, perceived ethnicity, perceived national origin, or perceived religion. And all these interactions, when people come into contact with police, usually end up causing situations that people are frightened, people are going through a situation where they don't know what to do, and this it permeates the whole community, and it affects the trust in the community. It also hinders community policing. So all of these things are negative consequences of mass incarceration.
Yeah. And we have seen also how hard, at the consulate, how hard it is to build this trust with the law enforcement authorities, especially when the news highlight those type of incidents in the media. But Sheri, why do you think it's so important to talk about race when we talk about mass incarceration?
Well, I have to say first that I'm very honored to be here. I thought when when the singer came, I thought, and she said she's an imposter. Well, so I'm really an imposter. But I think you get allies where you can get them, and so I'm happy to be seen as an ally. I think my own experience mostly is with capital defense work. So mass incarceration is really Edgar's experience, but I do think that there are many parallels in the capital punishment world, where when you look at, and I practice primarily in the South and in Texas, and in those areas, overwhelmingly the death rows are comprised of people who are African American and Latino, and the experiences of those people are not just sort of statistical differences, so that it's not just a matter of, oh, maybe just they committed more crimes, more terrible crimes. When you look at the trials of those people, and starting from arrest and moving onward, you see explicit examples of racism where people say things that are completely unacceptable, and then you see hidden things, and then you see subconscious, the subconscious influence of race in decisions making of juries. So from the process of when someone is arrested to the decision to seek death, to the jury's decision making, in that whole range of decisions, you see the influence of race and ethnicity.
And you were telling us in the morning about this case where somebody that is detained in death penalty, the judge said something like he could be dangerous in the future because he was Latino.
So this is Victor Saldaño, who is from Argentina. And in his case, there was an expert who was put up, the prosecutor put up an expert who said, he's going to be dangerous in the future, that's why you should execute him, and he's more likely to be dangerous in the future because he's Latino. And actually, it's interesting, the overlap there. This same expert also testified in other cases involving African American defendants that they were more likely to be dangerous in the future because of their race. And so I think that's one example of, and he got a new trial, but I think the thing that's hard to say is, so it's a terrible thing to say that, it's a terrible thing to explicitly say race is a justification for someone being executed, but even when those words are not said to juries, those are things that are in people's heads from all of the way in which they have been socialized. And so it is really hard to imagine that they're going to be making those decisions without the influence of race.
If we can pass to the second slide, because numbers can present a complete reality. We have put the information. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit, my throat is not so good now. Numbers can say a lot, and we have put there some information that is very clear that there are some type of bias when we talk about access of justice for brown and black communities. In 2020, 77.2% of federal offenders were members of communities of color. 51.4% of white federal offenders are related with drugs and fire crimes. 70% of black offenders are related with those two crimes. For Hispanic, the largest number, 68.4%, is concentrated in crimes related with immigration law. Black Americans are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated by drugs-related offenses than their white counterparts, despite equal substance usage rate. Also, they will serve nearly the same amount of time as white defendants would for a violent crime. So that says a lot once we see the numbers. And in that area, Sheri, as a capital defender lawyer, what kind of bias have you seen affecting black and brown communities, defendants? You should already talk about this case, but what other can you really highlight?
So I think that, another case, I represent Carlos Ayestes, and in his case, the prosecutor listed as a reason that they were going to seek death that he was not an American citizen. I also have represented Curtis Flowers in the Supreme Court of the United States, and the state of Mississippi was seeking the execution of a man who was completely innocent, had never done anything wrong, and they accomplished that by striking African Americans off of the jury so that a biased white jury could continue to convict him. They tried him 6 times. And, you know, the end of that story is a mixed bag. So in the end, Curtis Flowers is now a free man, and the state of Mississippi has admitted that they were prosecuting a man wrongly who was on death row for 23 years. But really, that is not a vindication of our system, because the reason that they dropped that only 2 years after seeking in the Supreme Court to kill him is because the Attorney General office changed hands in the state of Mississippi, and so a different party took control, and then the Republicans decided that they wanted to blame it on the Democrats, which meant that Mr. Flowers went free. And so I think if you look at many, many cases, there's an attempt to make juries white, all white or almost all white, in order to bias the determination of guilt and then also the determination of sentence. And when you talk to jurors, they have the biases that are prevalent in our culture, and so the more, in many cases, you see explicit discussions of race, but even when you don't see those explicit discussions, you see people who are convicted and sentenced to death for crimes that white defendants would not be sentenced to death.
And for example, we have also seen that sometimes technicalities make some persons go free, and not the essence of human rights. That will be the base of any type of sentence. But the defendants make really a good job to take people out of the raw death penalty. So in this area, Edgar, how have the war of drugs and the criminalization of immigration had affected the access of justice?
Yeah, so the war on drugs has been a huge driver for mass incarceration and access to justice. You know, I mentioned earlier that there was a disproportionate application of sentencing and also a selective enforcement of criminal laws. But you have to dig a little deeper just to see where the injustice is. You know, one of the drugs that many people are arrested for, especially in the black and brown communities, is the possession of crack cocaine. And before 2010, just having 5 grams of crack cocaine gave you the same sentence as a person who was convicted of or charged with possessing 500 grams of cocaine powder. And so there was a 100-to-1 ratio of how disproportionate the sentencing that for drug offenses was applied, and that unfortunately disproportionately affected the black community, where crack cocaine had been introduced long before into those neighborhoods. And so when you have that kind of system with disproportionate application of criminal laws and specifically drug laws, where you're talking about the same drug, just sort of a different form of it, you have a system where, unfortunately, some people have access to justice, others don't. And then you, on top of that, you know, we talk about access to justice from the very beginning, from the first interaction with police. It's important to know, too, that the bail system, in other words, requiring cash bail, in other words, you know, it used to be the case that you had to pay a certain amount of money to ensure that you would appear for court. That system has evolved really into a money-making system where only those who are wealthy enough to afford bail, otherwise known in Spanish as fianza, would be free, but those who could not stayed in jail. So in many cases, you have people who have not even been charged with a crime, who are simply detained, who have not been charged, who have not been found guilty of anything, but having to wait months and years in prison because they can't afford the bail. So all these access points to justice are systematically denied to certain people, and it's mostly affecting poor people and people of color.
Definitely, it's one of the type of discriminations, not only the race, but also the socioeconomic status of the person. In that, having that in mind, Professor Manuel, sorry, last time you told me, don't tell me, Professor, but what is the concept of participatory defense, and how does that affect the discrimination in the courts?
Thank you. And before I jump right into that question, I just want to take a moment. Whenever we speak of war, there's casualties involved in that. And it doesn't end at that moment, but the violence is intergenerational and it's trapped in those bodies and the babies, and it's trapped and it continues to be passed on. So I just want to take that moment, especially as we spoke about the war on drugs. I myself, I'm sitting here in large part because my neighborhood was a casualty of the war on drugs. In addition to that, before that, we had the war on poverty. And we saw it was mainly Latinx and black bodies that was casualties of the war on poverty. And now we're in the midst of another war, so this might be controversial, so don't attribute it to nobody here, but we have the war on guns. And I would argue those casualties of the war on guns are Latinx and black bodies. Now, wait a minute. At some point, when will we learn in terms of this idea of the same tools that we've been using won't change anything? Those are not my words. Audre Lorde, who's phenomenal, once stated, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So the concept of we come and we struggle and we fight together to be in these positions of leadership, in these positions of power, and then we assimilate. We take the same tools, we do the same thing, and we get the same results. So that was a long-winded way of reaching us into participatory defense. It is this concept in which the community is the focal point of anyone's defense, where the mothers, the aunts, the fathers, the cousins, the brothers, they are critical to the institution to be able to defend somebody, because it is a process that goes towards healing, which is very, very different. I think the panel before talked about, what's the code word the city of Chicago was using? United we heal, I think. So yeah, this concept of united we heal, but divided we harm. So even as I look at these stats here, drugs and firearms, 70%, and I think we could all, or most of us could agree when you hear drugs and nonviolence, yes, no more nonviolent crimes. But when you hear firearms, something goes up. And I live in Chicago. I live on the north side of Chicago, and Chicago is struggling with gun violence. I am not arguing that. However, what we're struggling with too is our addiction to how we handle it. We're overly incarcerating people who oftentimes themselves are survivors of gun violence. They're survivors. So just like people who are struggling with drugs and are survivors, we've taken them and we only have one lens in which we can provide access to justice. And that lens is a lens of which excommunication and the othering, they're different, they're others, they broke this rule, so therefore they don't belong in this community. Strong parallels, by the way, as to what we do with immigration in the United States. So participatory defense would say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this. If you have this, these are the stats. If you have a bunch of young people out there in the southwest side in Little Village that's going around and carrying guns because they witnessed the shooting, they were shot at, what would it look like for us to think about what does a 15, a 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old need in order to feel welcome in being part of this community. I go back to the story I had with me and my little brother, where we knew we couldn't go to the police. We had to hide out. Well, what do you do if you keep getting shot at? So it is this idea, this concept, when you say participatory defense, okay, what would that look like instead of if somebody is in possession of a firearm and because they don't have a license, because in the state of Illinois, you could just get a license. It's literally just pay to get the license. So instead of them looking at a mandatory 2 years in prison, 3 years, depending on their background, what would it look like for the community to be mandatorily involved in that person and help in that healing? So most of it is community-led, and it is activating the community in the defense of somebody who's in and out of the court system.
And what have you said is really, really important, because it has been said the law has been written by white men, heterosexual men. So the interpretation of law is also really, really needed to be done by Hispanics and also by Black communities. So from your area of working and expertise, what do you think it needs to be done to have more lawyers or more public defenders or more teachers talking about or promoting the interpretation of law from our communities, from the Black and brown communities? I will pass the microphone to Edgar.
Yeah, so I would echo some of what Emmanuel said. You know, I think the concept of justice needs to be thought of more broadly. What does it really mean to have justice for someone? And, you know, in Emmanuel's example, you know, you think about the community aspect. And I think what we need to really assess justice is to have Black and brown voices in determining what is just and what is not just. You know, I'm a civil rights lawyer for the ACLU, and I've been doing this for a long time, but I feel like for me and personally, this is something that I've been preparing to do since I was a little kid, because as a young brown kid in Pasadena, Texas, which used to host the state headquarters for the KKK back when I was a little kid, I was immediately confronting racial tensions in the community that I grew up in. My parents were immigrants from Mexico, but I was born in Texas. And even as a little kid, you see the differences in treatment. You see that, you know, your parents might have difficulty in language or people treat them differently. All these things shape your understanding of the world around you. And so for me, I think having the experiences of those of us who have experienced racial profiling, those of us who have experienced racism, even though I'm born in America, I still faced racism growing up. I still faced discrimination. But, you know, I found a way to harness that energy and do something with it, which for me was to learn to apply myself in school and then go to college and become a lawyer and fight for people like my parents, people like the immigrants you hear about who are being caged. And so I think when you have that perspective and you have, you know, educators or academics like Emmanuel and others who come from those experiences, who can share personal stories about what it's like to hide under a bed in fear because ICE might split up your family. I mean, I think you have to think holistically about justice and really be more thoughtful about what it is that's going to ultimately make our community a better place, a safer place where people feel like they belong.
Yeah, that's true. I will ask if you can pass to the next graphic, where we can appreciate the mass incarceration in local jails. So if you can see, death penalty status have 27 states have death penalty. The states that have imposed moratorium are California, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, and the U.S. government has declared moratorium on federal executions. On April 2021, there were 2,5 504 death row prisoners in the United States. So, Sheri, I would like to know, how do you see, from your point of view as a teacher, as an academic, how do you see that young generations have the interpretation of the death penalty, the rules that are applied, the laws that are now in moratorium? What's the new view of the new generations regarding this topic?
Well, I think that from when I started practicing doing death penalty work, the number of death penalty states has gone down dramatically. And that has been a coalition of people, some of whom are very conservative and who have no empathy for death row inmates, but who just think it costs too much. It costs too much, and therefore we don't. And in California, the cost is astronomical. The cost is very high in Texas too. So some people say, no, let's get rid of it for that reason. I think other people too have an awareness of the impossibility of doing this in a fair way. And I wanted to say something about that as why race is so intimately involved in the imposition of the death penalty. And I think that is something I hope younger people have a better appreciation of. Historically, the way that we have made people to be less than human is through race. That's what we do. And so in order to decide to execute someone, you have to decide that they're less than a human being. So I think it's not surprising that in death penalty cases there's much more use of race. I have another case I worked on where they called the defendant King Kong. Why did they do that? They did that in order to make him seem more like an animal, more like someone that you could dispose of. And I think I have hope that younger people are less willing to accept that, and more willing to say, well, as you were saying, it's a whole system. And the system that made the person do the crime we ought to look at the system that produces the children who were not helped by the child welfare system despite being abused. If we could actually diminish more violence by investing in our children than investing in death row. And I'm optimistic that more young people are going to see that and do see it. Even if you look now, there's less support for the death penalty among younger people than there is among older people.
So the world has future, having this new generation.
I have to hope so.
Also, Emmanuel, how do you see that this affects using the terms of discrimination and race in criminal court? Does it affect, does it helps the cases? How do you see it?
In terms of using the terms of race in court, and in actuality, we have, let me get the microphone again. Don't tell my wife I keep getting the microphone. To be honest with you, I don't know about federal court, but I know in state court, we have a very, very, very difficult time using the term race in court. It is as if it does not exist. So whenever I get up in court and I'm talking to a judge, if I say, well, judge, this is part of a cycle of violence and racism, the room gets just as quiet as it just did, just like that. Everyone will stop typing and look up because it is so uncomfortable and we cannot conceptualize it. We cannot make it an actual thing that we all are accountable for, though. Because sometimes it's easy to be detached from it. Well, that was then. That was these people. That's the judge. That's the cop who did it. That's not. And then in terms of internally, race is just, it's a difficult thing. Look around. This is a black and brown event. For those who are on Facebook, hello. But as I look out to all these beautiful faces, I wish there was more brown and black faces together. So it is not me just being critical of the space, but just to say internally what we need to do. And in terms of how we struggle with it in court, we struggle in court mightily. It is the absence of race. our push to make sure that race does not matter, that you see it actually perpetuate even more. For those of you who are not from Chicago, I challenge you, if you're going to stay here, you know, after you've had the great drinks, the great shrimp and everything else, the great food here, go down to Cook County. Sit in Cook County, sit in one of the courthouses, and watch who comes into the courthouses as defendants. Don't say anything, just watch. See what that does on your soul. Nothing, it could almost be predominantly black and brown faces. Now, as you watch, notice the amount of times issues of race and socioeconomic status and gender violence comes up. The silence is deafening. So I think it is really the silencing of that that is critical. And I'll leave it actually on these words. When I think about the silencing of that, somebody else brought up MLK. You know, there's those words. It's not the words of my enemies, right? It's not the words of my enemies, but it's the silence of my friends that I worry about that helps perpetuate what we're in. So
That's true. Now we will pass to an aspect that I'm very passionate about. It is about racial plus gender. And as I was telling you before, the laws have been written by men, white men, heterosexual men. So when we talk about how gender impacts the application of law, we have seen that there are at least 500 women currently in death penalty, in death row, around the world. Most of them have been sentenced for murder of close family members in a context of gender-based violence. So that's huge, because many of those women have reacted against domestic violence. In some cases, they don't have a fair trial. So I would like to have your opinion in this. Edgar, what are the obstacles women face through the criminal justice system?
I don't have to tell the women in this audience or on Facebook about the double standards that they face on a daily basis. But, you know, it's very evident that women, especially women serving time in prison, face significant challenges, burdens, because it's almost as if the state or the government that puts them in jail forgets that many of these women are the nucleus of their families. We talk about communities being affected and oftentimes destroyed when family members go to prison. And we see that a lot in the black community with the number of black males and fathers that are serving time in jail away from their children. But the impact of women and mothers going to jail is just as bad, if not worse. So, you know, in different contexts, women face different challenges. In the immigration detention context, you have women who are shackled even when they're pregnant. And so, you know, oftentimes women are not provided the hygienic and other care necessary for them in the prison context. And so, you know, when you have a system that is dominated and controlled by males, where the guards are mostly men, where you know, you do have some regulations that you know, assure some kind of protection for women, but in general, women are at the mercy of you know, a male-dominated judicial system that doesn't see them in the same way as they see themselves.
Yeah. And at the Consular Network, we have been working very close in order to give migrant women the support that they require in order to have access of justice. And what we have identified is that in many occasions, they don't have access of justice because they don't know the language, they don't know the legal structure, they don't know who is who of the law enforcement authorities. For them, a uniform represents ICE for all of them. So that's why we have been trying to help them to have that access, to make the reports in time of domestic violence, to accompany them in the process, to obtain the U visa, their VAWA visa, their T visa, whatever. But for example, when they are in jail, we receive our mission is to give response to all the letters that we receive to those inmates that are in our jurisdiction, in our circumscription. And in many of those letters are mainly of men. We hardly receive letters sent by women to the consulates. So I don't know, Sheri, how do you see the impact of gender in the cases of death penalty?
So it's interesting to think about discrimination on the basis of gender, because mostly discrimination on the basis of gender helps women in the death penalty, mostly. But it helps white women more than it helps women of color. And so when we look at, if you look at who gets sentenced to death, who are women of color, it's very hard to understand why their crimes are worse than the crimes of people who get much lesser sentences. And I think that is related to stereotypes of who counts as a woman, what counts as being feminine. And I think we see that the benefit women often get because of their role in the family, or because they are thought of as less central to the criminal enterprise, that benefit often is not extended to women of color. And something else that's rather similar to that is youth. Now, normally we think of youth as very mitigating. So a person who's only 19 years old, he has his whole life ahead of him. Maybe he made a terrible mistake. We will tend to think of him as still having a potential to reform. But if we look at the sentences of 19 and 20-year-olds, the people who are sentenced to death, who in that 19, 20-year-old range, 21, they're almost entirely people of color. Like it's 80, 90% of them are. And that is because of stereotypes of black and brown individuals as not really being children. When we have psychological studies that you show someone, a black child who's 12, and you show them a white child who's 12, and they think of the black child as much older and much more responsible. And so we have the same intersectionality problems that we were talking about before, which is that things that are often thought of as mitigating, whether it's gender or age or role, are not seen that same way when we're talking about women and young people of color.
And when we, sorry.
If I can add too, and I see this more in the immigration detention space, but many of the women that are currently detained in ICE custody or even CBP custody are women that are coming to this country seeking asylum. What that means is that most often they are escaping persecution from the countries they come from. And I've been in these detention centers having interviewed these women, especially a few years ago during the family separation crisis. Part of my job was to document and take affidavits of these women to find out when their kids were separated, what happened, how they got here. And the stories just tore my heart apart. Many of these women were being prosecuted in their home countries because they are women. Gangs and cartels would come after women, recruit them for sex slaves, and if they didn't comply, they would be killed, sometimes tortured. So women sought escape, and they come to the U.S. already with significant trauma. In their passage and journey through Mexico getting to the U.S., many women are often the victims of sexual violence. And so we often forget when we are processing women through the immigration detention proceedings, we forget that this trauma is something that's very deep. We forget that many of the women who are pregnant in detention probably were not pregnant by their own choosing. And without taking full consideration of the traumas and the significant issues that a lot of the women that are currently in detention have to deal with, then you're creating a system that is completely unjust and unfair to these women who are simply seeking a safe place to live.
Thank you, Edgar. That's true. But, and Shirley, you were talking about how the impact that youth has or that the justice system has in youth. So I would like to ask you, Emmanuel, how does race and gender impact the criminal system? Sorry, again, the microphone.
No, you're good. Keep passing the mic. I love it. Well, I'm happy you said it like that in terms of, not keeping it separate. I think someone spoke to this before. The importance of intersectionality is absolutely critical. But when you do look at, I think before I talked about sometimes we inherit stuff. We inherit our own traumas, and I think before the panel before us talked about the civil rights era. So the amount of violence against women in that era was almost unspoken of, because a lot of our leaders and everything else like that, we couldn't really incorporate it. And so now we're in a space that oftentimes the gender-based violence and how it plays out in the criminal system is often unspoken of. What was said earlier in terms of the amount of women that are punished for quote-unquote crimes of survival, it's not spoken of. And oftentimes there's no defense to that, where you would have somebody who's a survivor of domestic violence or whatever it is, and they respond. And then how our system looks at that, especially when you talk about women and children, that's very different. I mean, going back to the crack era, the war on drugs, we birthed a whole new way of prosecuting just women because they were quote-unquote crack babies. There are not a lot of dads being prosecuted from that. So that was coming from a lens of gender-based violence, from an institutional lens of gender-based violence. And I think that's something that we need to continue to think about as we move forward, not separating them, but just sort of how that intersectionality impacts that. But with that said, though, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There's tons of phenomenal organizations out there that are helping and that are pushing back. There's an organization called Survived and Punished that deals with exactly that, with exactly those issues, to be able to help lift up those stories and those issues. So,
yeah. So, can we pass to the next one? We tried to put there some of the more important parts of the access of justice. Some of them are to have continuity. Access of justice needs to have continuity. It needs to be speed, fast, rapid, and it needs to guarantee not to make any distinction between race, social status, all that, gender, for example, no. But from your very personal point of view, in order to really, really grant access of justice, what would you do in your area, in each one of your area? For example, in ACLU, what are you doing in order to assure access of justice? Because we have been talking about a process. Shirley, you've been talking about how you intervene in the cases of death penalty, but in order to access of justice from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, so at the ACLU, we take a broad view of fighting to make change. And, whether it's litigating in the courts, advocating in the legislatures or in Congress, or activism in the streets, we push for that through public education. And specifically with regards to access to justice, one of the big campaigns that we have is to call attention to the way the bail practices in this country are handled, and the unfairness of the process, where if you have enough money, you don't have to serve time in jail. But if you're poor and can't afford the bail, which oftentimes is very excessive for families, then you have to sit there and wait in jail. We think that those things are obviously wrong. We think that that's illegal, because most of our cases, we rely on the U.S. Constitution and the rights granted, including the promise of equal protection under the law, the promise of having a speedy trial, the promise of not having excessive bail. We rely on these parts of the Constitution to fight in the courts. So that's one way we do it, but it has to be a multifaceted approach. You can't just be fighting in the courts. By the time you get a win in the courts, a lot of bad stuff has already happened. We have to think again, holistically, using advocacy, public education, litigation where necessary, and pushing Congress and our legislatures, because it has to be a community effort, a broad effort, and part of what we do is giving the community the resources to fight back.
So I think that one thing that's important is to increase the number of lawyers of color who are involved in public defense. It really, which is not to say that white lawyers can't be effective. Communicating with clients is really an important thing, and having greater access to people who look like you, whose experiences might be more similar, that's an important thing. And so I just make a little pitch right now. If you know someone who wants to go to law school, find me. I'm applying into the Cornell Law School. I really, I try very hard to increase the numbers of lawyers who are students of color. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is service on juries. No one really likes to serve on juries. I'm just going to say it's a big pain. You think you have another life and you have other things you want to do, but it's extraordinarily important to have minority participation in the criminal justice system. I think when I look at the cases in which death was not obtained, it's almost, for our clients of color, it's virtually always when there were two or more people of color on the jury. So I think adding participation there is important. But then I'm also going to say, with respect to the death penalty, really, I do not think you can eradicate racism from the imposition of the death penalty. I think that's just not impossible if we look sort of backwards in time. You know, the precursor of the death penalty in the United States is lynching. And it's, there were 2,000 African Americans lynched between the end of the Civil War and about 1950. But there were also about 600 Mexican and Mexican Americans lynched in that same time period. We use violence as a tool of racial oppression. And so, in my opinion, the stereotypes and the motivations that are behind the death penalty, they really can't be separated from racism. So while I would encourage people to go to law school and encourage people to participate in juries, in the capital realm, in the death penalty realm, I think the only real way to end the influence of race and ethnic bias is by ending the death penalty.
And that's probably the case for most. That's probably the case for most criminal aspects of our system, because again, after 240 years of slavery and over 90 years of legalized racial segregation, it's created a systemic problem where people are racially profiled and perceptions of their criminality are included in the sentencing and the enforcement of criminal laws.
So how can we begin to build trust in that system? Because we are highlighting the deficiencies of the system, but how can we build trust? I think that you said something about working with the communities, and you also mentioned it. How can we begin to do that? And Ambassador Torres was talking about the need of intersection agenda between black and brown communities and gender, the Me Too movement. How can we begin to build that trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely being very intentional about that intersectionality. Although one last thing I would like to push back on is even this concept of building trust. I think we got to be careful about that. I worry about us in that concept of building trust. Now we're assimilating and therefore we're validating. For a lot of people out there, they don't believe in these systems and these institutions. So I would like to say, something we need to do is rethink what that justice looks like, right? One that's more built on concepts of restorative justice, transformative justice, which is concept that's, I think, right in line with indigenous black and brown folks. So just how does that look, and how does that compare to this very westernized concept of justice that we've inherited and grown up in? So I think we need to continue to think about that, and also how do we center community in all that, right? So, I told you all before, okay, go down to 26 in California and Chicago, because that is the hub of justice. And you go all throughout the states, all throughout the United States, there's going to be a city, there's going to be a big old courtroom, and that is the hub that represents justice. What would it look like for us to be able to honor what people are doing in communities and trying to lift up those voices? I think is absolutely critical. And I'm going to leave it on this end. When we think about things like the death penalty and everything else like that, I think a lot of people oh my goodness, most people, I would say, that is horrific. That is horrible. But we got to keep in mind the historical moment of time that we're in. Because back then, not everybody thought that was horrific. Not everybody thought that was horrible. We have to be able to honor that. I think the beautiful artist, Jessica, actually, she mentioned it. She said a line, which was taken from Billie Holiday, black bodies being swung at a tree. Now, when you conceptualize that, there's the black body, there's what's happening to that body in time, but we cannot forget what's happening to the community in time that is standing there and watching. That's what we got to guard against. That's what we got to be careful about, that we are not just standing and watching, and we're being willing to be uncomfortable in the moment and pushing for something different and not validating what exists.
Thank you so much, Manuel. So I think that we need to really focus in trying to make that possible, as you can see it in the screen, to have more trustful judicial institutions, to make administration of justice more accessible and understanding to the common people, because sometimes we don't understand who is who and how to make what, to have more legal service and legal aid programs in order to avoid that disadvantage of not having enough economic resources to pay maybe a lawyer or to pay a bail, and also to have more community engagement. For me, it was a really great, surprising for me in a good way, to see these young people, young generations that participate today, the girl that made this wonderful song, also the other you that have the presentation that you make about your organization, just wonderful. Yesterday, we also have very interesting contribution of young people. Well, the future is yours. We are responsible to pass you the torch, but you are the responsible to build also a better world. Give us the ideas, tell us what we can do in order to make this more possible and to really make access of justice something that is respected, something really integrating the human rights of everybody. I don't want to monopolize the microphone. I would like to have more interaction with the public. If you have any question to ask to the panelists, they are here. They are going to leave today. So, no, you're not going to leave today, but take advantage of that, please. Is there any question? Yeah. Oh.
You might want to put that one in the middle just in case.
Which one? That one? Okay.
Thank you, and congratulations for a magnificent roundtable. It was so enlightening, so much information and so much struggle to digest everything that is taking place, and you so correctly presented. My comment has to do with, what can you say about the most important university for us in Illinois is the University of Illinois. It's our counterpart as a public university. And the campus in Springfield, the Department of Legal Studies, started in 2002 this very, very impressive program called the Illinois Innocence Project that identified those that are very likely to be innocent but are still incarcerated. And now with the new technology, DNA, they are doing, from our point of view, a magnificent job to starting to do that. Any comments about that? Is that replicating somewhere else? How do you relate to the university in that extent?
Okay. So there are innocent projects at a lot of law schools now, and I think that's a great development. But I think it is important to notice that DNA in particular actually is involved in relatively few crimes. So the picture that people have, which is that if I am innocent and I get a DNA test, it'll all worked out. That's usually not the case. So there are going to continue to be, even despite such projects, there are going to be people who are wrongly incarcerated because which is a reason we ought to treat all the incarcerated people well, because some of them have done nothing. But the other thing I would notice about innocence is that in the public, we tend to think about this, oh, you weren't there, you did nothing, or else you're guilty. And often there's a finer line than that. Sometimes someone has been charged with a crime that is much more serious than the crime they actually participated in. And so those people don't get a lot of attention either. And so the project about innocence is also connected to the project that Emmanuel was talking about, which is that sometimes there's innocence in a different way, which is that you're carrying a gun because you had to carry a gun because you couldn't go to the police about what it was you needed to protect yourself. So I'm very supportive of innocence projects, and I'm grateful to have been able to represent a couple of innocent defendants. But I think that is only a small piece of the criminal justice project.
And I would add too that oftentimes you got to look at the fact that because of the bail practices that we have, where some people cannot afford to get out of jail while they wait either sentencing or their legal proceedings, oftentimes the wait could be months, weeks, or longer. And many people will rather plead guilty to a crime simply to avoid being in jail for a long time. And so many of the people that are actually charged with crimes do so out of necessity or not wanting to just stay in jail for a long time simply because they cannot pay the bail.
Do you want to say final point? Microphone here.
It's hard to pass on the mic. I don't get a microphone a lot at home. No, I think it was already said though. I think we do need to be very, very conscious and careful about our love and addiction of the purity of innocence and what that means. Because a lot of, if you go back to some of the stats, a lot of what we've been talking about is, perpetrators and victims and how we bifurcate that, and therefore people can't get services that they deserve. So.
Thank you so much. I think that we are over in the time. I would like to, there's a question over there.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for all the knowledge that you have shared with us this morning. I think that really opens up the eyes of a lot of people in regards to the court system and the prison system. And I think that one of the things that I would like to just share with you is the fact that I think that the lawyers are like the last line of defense for people who are charged with a crime. After that, it's much more difficult to do anything with them. I think that before they get to you, there's got a lot of things need to happen. And I think all panelists mentioned the fact that we have to look at the problem, organically, comprehensive. And I think that we need to also pay a lot of attention to the work that groups like, the groups with Sandra Davila are active. A lot of work has to be done in the community. And I think that one of the things that we need to do at the community level is re-educate the community's concept of the justice system and law enforcement. I think that we need to stop the feeder to the prison system. The prison system is a big business. So, they're going to fight you left and right if you want to stop sending prisoners to them, and especially the private prison system. we need to stop the feeder that is sending people to those prisons. We have to stop that at the community level. And I think that we need to re-educate the community. For example, when Black Lives Matter started talking about defunding the police, I think that the majority of our community didn't understand what that meant, and they were afraid to support something like that. And I think that Chicago, for example, spends more than 50% of its budget on the police. And I think that if you cut that in half, I don't think crime will get higher. It'll probably stay level, because, you know, the police, the definition of the police is not to prevent crime. No, you come in after the crime. So we need to do a lot of work with the community institutions and movements and organizations like Black Lives Matter, and also the ones that are active in the Latino community. But just like high schools depend on grammar schools to feed students to them, and if you stop feeding those students to them, high schools go out of business. I think we need to do the same thing and spend a lot more of that resources that go to law enforcement into community programs that are going to help stop that feeding of the prisoners to the prison system.
You want to say something? I want to pass you the microphone. Yeah.
You know, I think that's a very important point. I think public education is going to be key. It's been key now, and it's going to be key for the future generations. You know, Efren earlier mentioned the digital age and our access to information that the younger generations have. They have, you know, the young folks, and I say this as a parent of a teenager, they know a lot more at their age than what we did at our age, because they have this access to information. And I think that when you talk about like how it's going to be a challenge to overcome the prison pipeline, you're absolutely right, because when you peel the covers, you see that it is a huge business. The private prisons, there's a huge lobbying industry that supports the private prisons. And when people start getting released from the prisons for crimes, then you start seeing those beds getting filled by immigrants. So there's always sort of this effort to make money off of black and brown bodies, and I think we need to educate folks, because when people realize that much of the prison industry is a money-making industry that profits off the bodies of black and brown people, people will not like that. People will be questioning that. And I think that's part of what we need to do, is educate the people, peel behind the scenes, and follow the money.
You know, I would add one more thing, since we can say thank you to the Mexican consulate, because I would, not only for this program, but also observing how they have served the inmates who are incarcerated on death row, how they show love and concern for them and their families. It is a beautiful thing to see, but it's also a thing that we ought to try to do in our own communities for all of the people who are incarcerated. Because if we really want to change something, we don't change it by incarcerating them longer or killing them. If we're going to break the cycle that you're talking about, what we have to do is show concern for them.
So thank you very much. I think that working all together, NGOs, academic institutions, lawyers, we can make access of justice a reality. And well, here you have 3 lawyers. Lawyers are good persons, please. So thank you very much for all. Thank you.
Thank you.
They satanize us.